Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The camping trip I never wanted. What if I told you that the happiest families I've met in America weren't spending their weekends at luxury resorts or expensive shopping malls but sleeping in a simple tent with no Wi-Fi, no television, and sometimes not even a phone signal? I laughed the first time my husband suggested a camping trip. Honestly, I thought it sounded uncomfortable, boring, and completely unnecessary. But one unexpected weekend deep in nature changed not only my marriage and my family, it completely changed the way I understood happiness. If you're wondering why millions of Americans love camping so much, stay with me, because the answer surprised me more than anything I've experienced in years. My name is Emma, and this story happened not long ago. During an ordinary weekend here in the United States, life had become busy in the quietest way possible. My husband worked long hours. The children were always moving between school, sports, homework, and endless activities. I was constantly checking messages, planning meals, paying bills, and telling myself that next weekend would finally be relaxing. It never was. Even when we were all sitting in the same living room, each of us was somehow living inside a different screen. One evening my husband looked up from his laptop and smiled. I booked a campsite. I stared at him. A campsite. He nodded proudly. No hotels, no cabins, just us, a tent and nature. I honestly thought he was joking. You paid money to sleep on the ground. The kids, however, exploded with excitement. We're going camping. I was the only person in the house who looked completely unconvinced. For the next several days, I secretly searched online for things like bugs in American campgrounds, what if bears visit your campsite, and how to survive camping without coffee. The search results didn't exactly comfort me. Still, Saturday morning arrived. Our SUV was packed with sleeping bags, folding chairs, marshmallows, hiking boots, and enough snacks to survive what looked more like an expedition than a weekend getaway. As we drove farther away from the city, something unusual happened. The buildings slowly disappeared. Traffic became lighter. Tall trees replaced busy streets. The air looked cleaner somehow. Then my phone buzzed. One bar of signal. A few minutes later, no signal at all. I immediately looked at my husband. I don't have internet. He smiled. I know. What if someone needs us? He laughed gently. What if we need each other instead? I rolled my eyes, but deep inside, his words stayed with me. When we finally arrived at the campground, I couldn't believe how many families were already there. Children were riding bicycles through the trees. Parents were setting up tents together. Grandparents sat beside campfires telling stories. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody appeared stressed. No one was staring at a phone. It felt like stepping into another version of America that I had never noticed before. While unpacking our gear, our neighbor at the next campsite smiled and waved. Beautiful day for camping. I smiled back and answered with one simple English sentence. It's our first time here. She laughed warmly. You're going to love it. That short conversation became my first English lesson of the trip. Real words, real smiles, real life. Somehow, practicing English felt much easier when it happened naturally instead of inside a textbook. Researchers often explain that spending time in nature can lower stress hormones, improve mood, and help families communicate more openly. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about science. I was thinking about one question. Why did everyone here already look happier than they had an hour ago? I believed the hardest part of camping would be sleeping in a tent. I couldn't have been more wrong. That evening, just as the sun disappeared behind the trees and the forest became completely quiet, we heard a strange sound outside our tent. My husband froze. The children stopped talking. And I suddenly realized we might not be alone in the woods after all. The children were whispering inside their sleeping bags. Then we heard heavy footsteps moving just outside the tent. My heart started racing, and for one unforgettable minute, I was convinced our camping adventure had become the biggest mistake our family had ever made. Nobody spoke. The sound came again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Leaves moved just beyond the thin fabric of our tent. I looked at my husband. He looked back at me without saying a word. Even our children stopped breathing loudly, as if silence could somehow make us invisible. I quietly whispered, "What was that?" He smiled, but I could tell he wasn't completely sure either. "I'll take a look." I grabbed his arm immediately. "No," he laughed softly. "If it's a bear, I promise I won't invite it inside." Even in that nervous moment, we couldn't help smiling. He slowly unzipped the tent. The zipper sounded unbelievably loud in the quiet forest. He stepped outside with a flashlight. Several long seconds passed. Then we heard him laughing. "You have to see this." I carefully stepped outside. Standing only a few feet away was a family of curious raccoons. One of them had somehow discovered the bag of marshmallows we had forgotten on the picnic table. The children burst into laughter. I laughed too, partly because it was funny, and partly because the enormous fear inside my mind had disappeared in an instant. Our camping neighbor heard the commotion and walked over carrying a flashlight. "First camping trip?" she asked with a knowing smile. I nodded. "How could you tell?" She pointed toward the open bag of marshmallows. "The raccoons always welcome the newcomers." We all laughed together. Then she gently explained one of the most important camping rules in America. Always lock your food away before bedtime. Simple advice, big lesson. That short conversation became another unexpected English practice opportunity. She spoke slowly, clearly, and naturally. I repeated one sentence several times so I wouldn't forget it. "Keep food inside the car." Just 5 simple words. Easy pronunciation, useful vocabulary, and thanks to one hungry raccoon, I knew I would remember that sentence forever. Later that evening, we gathered around our first campfire. The flames danced quietly while the sky slowly filled with stars. Something strange happened. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody complained about missing Wi-Fi anymore. Instead, my children started telling funny stories from school. My husband talked about camping trips he had enjoyed as a child. I realized we had been talking continuously for almost an hour without a single interruption from notifications. Researchers have found that spending time in natural environments can reduce mental fatigue while increasing meaningful family conversations. Sitting beside that campfire, I didn't need scientific studies to convince me. I could actually feel the difference. My mind seemed quieter. My breathing felt slower. Even laughter sounded different when there were no traffic noises in the background. Before going to sleep, my daughter leaned against my shoulder. "Mom, yes, I think the forest feels alive." I looked around at the tall trees gently moving in the evening breeze. "It does." She smiled. "I like it." Those 3 words surprised me more than anything else that day. The child who usually begged for more screen time had completely forgotten about her tablet. As I crawled back into my sleeping bag, I realized something even stranger. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about tomorrow's schedule. I wasn't checking emails. I wasn't worrying about unfinished chores. Nature had somehow pressed a reset button inside my mind. But the next morning would test that peaceful feeling in a way none of us expected. Just after sunrise, a park ranger stopped at our campsite with an urgent announcement. And within seconds, every family around us started packing in complete silence. The morning everything changed. Imagine waking up in the middle of a peaceful forest only to see every family around you packing their tents at incredible speed. No panic, no shouting, just calm faces moving with surprising purpose. When a park ranger stopped beside our campsite that morning, I instantly imagined the worst. Was there a wildfire? A dangerous animal? Had we done something wrong? The answer was completely unexpected. And what happened next taught me one of the most important lessons I have ever learned about nature, family, and why so many Americans keep coming back to the wilderness. The ranger greeted us with a friendly smile. "Good morning, folks." His calm voice immediately made me feel a little better. "We have a weather alert." I looked up. The sky was still blue. Birds were singing. Nothing looked dangerous. He continued. "A strong afternoon storm is expected. We're asking campers in this area to move to the campground on the other side of the lake before noon." That was all. No drama. No fear. Just preparation. What surprised me wasn't the weather forecast. It was the reaction of everyone around us. Nobody complained. Nobody argued. Families simply helped one another. One couple carried an elderly camper's cooler. Teenagers folded extra chairs for their neighbors. A father I'd never met offered to help us take down our tent. I whispered to my husband, "Why is everyone helping each other?" He smiled. "That's camping." Within minutes, strangers felt more like teammates than neighbors. I realized something beautiful. In the forest, nobody seemed interested in showing off. People simply wanted everyone to be safe. As we packed our campsite, our children worked together without being asked. Normally I had to remind them several times to help around the house. Here, they naturally cooperated. Maybe nature changes children. Or maybe it changes parents first. During the short drive to the new campground, we passed winding roads surrounded by tall pine trees and sparkling water. Nobody in our car was looking at a screen. Instead, we were looking out the windows. Really looking. My son suddenly pointed toward the trees. "Look, a deer." We all turned at exactly the same moment. For only a few seconds, a beautiful white-tailed deer stood quietly between the trees before disappearing into the forest. Nobody reached for a camera. Nobody worried about missing the perfect photo. We simply watched. Some memories don't need a picture. They only need your full attention. When we arrived at the new campsite, another family welcomed us with a warm smile. "Need a hand?" Before I could answer, they were already helping us raise the tent. Their kindness felt completely natural. While working together, we talked about camping, hiking, and favorite national parks. I practiced another simple English sentence. "Thank you for your help." They smiled. "You're welcome." Short conversation, real communication. No pressure. That was becoming my favorite way to practice English. Simple words spoken in meaningful moments stay in your memory much longer than vocabulary lists. Researchers have found that spending time outdoors often strengthens cooperation because natural environments encourage shared problem solving and reduce everyday distractions. Looking around our new campsite, I could actually see that happening. People weren't competing with each other. They were quietly building a temporary community. Helping someone else felt completely normal. By late afternoon, the weather forecast proved correct. Dark clouds rolled across the sky. Heavy rain began falling over the valley we had left only a few hours earlier. Standing safely beneath the shelter at our new campsite, I looked across the distant hills. If we had ignored the ranger's advice, our first camping trip could have become miserable. Instead, we stayed dry, prepared, grateful. That evening, after the storm passed, the air smelled fresh and clean. A rainbow slowly appeared above the trees. Everyone around us stopped what they were doing. Complete strangers stood together, quietly admiring the same beautiful view. No one hurried away. No one checked the time. And an elderly woman standing beside me whispered something I will never forget. "This is why Americans keep coming back." At first, I thought she was talking about the rainbow. A few minutes later, I realized she meant something much deeper, and her story beside the campfire that night would completely change the way I understood love, marriage, and the true meaning of camping. The couple who never missed a camping season. What if the secret to a long, happy marriage wasn't an expensive vacation, a perfect house, or even endless romance but returning to the same forest every single year. I thought the elderly woman beside the rainbow was simply enjoying the beautiful view. I couldn't have been more wrong. That evening, beside a glowing campfire, she shared a story so unexpected that it completely changed the way I looked at love, family, and why camping has become a treasured tradition for millions of American families. By the end of her story, I found myself asking one question I had never considered before. What if nature quietly repairs relationships without us even realizing it? The campfire burned gently as families gathered around with mugs of hot chocolate and toasted marshmallows. The stars above us seemed brighter than they had the night before. The elderly woman introduced herself as Linda. Her husband smiled warmly. "I'm Robert." They looked at each other with the kind of smile that only comes after many years together. Not perfect, just peaceful. Linda noticed me watching them. She laughed softly. "You think we've always been this happy?" I smiled honestly. "Yes." She shook her head. "Not even close." Everyone around the fire became surprisingly quiet. She looked into the flames before continuing. "There was a time when we almost stopped talking." I glanced at Robert. He nodded without embarrassment. "We were both busy." She continued. "Jobs, bills, raising children. We lived in the same house, but our conversations became shopping lists." I felt an uncomfortable connection to her words. Hadn't I been living that same pattern only a few weeks earlier? Linda smiled gently. "Then one summer, our daughter begged us to go camping." Robert laughed. "We didn't even own a tent." Everyone around the fire laughed with him. "So we borrowed one." She pointed toward the forest surrounding us. "That weekend changed everything." I leaned forward. "How?" There was nothing to distract us. No television, no endless phone calls, no rushing, no meetings, no schedules. We started talking again. Robert quietly added, "Really talking." He explained that their first camping trip felt awkward at first. They had forgotten how to enjoy silence together, but somewhere between morning coffee, beside the lake and watching the stars at night, conversations slowly returned, not because they forced themselves, because nature created space for them. That sentence stayed with me. Nature created space. I looked at my own husband sitting beside our children. He wasn't checking work emails. I wasn't thinking about tomorrow's grocery list. For the first time in a long while, we were simply present. Linda noticed my smile. "You understand now?" I nodded slowly. "I think I do." She continued with another surprising confession. "For 32 years, we've never missed a camping season, every spring, every summer, sometimes only one weekend, sometimes longer. It reminds us who we are." Those simple words somehow carried more wisdom than dozens of relationship books. Later, while our children played nearby, Robert helped my son gather firewood. He patiently showed him how to choose dry branches instead of wet ones. Watching them together reminded me that children often learn life's greatest lessons by observing ordinary moments rather than listening to long speeches. Before bedtime, I practiced another simple English sentence. "The campfire feels warm." Easy words, natural rhythm, real memory. I repeated it several times while looking into the glowing flames. Learning English felt strangely effortless because every sentence belonged to a moment I wanted to remember forever. Relationship researchers often suggest that couples strengthen emotional connection through shared experiences rather than expensive gifts. Sitting there beside Linda and Robert, I realized I was watching living evidence of that idea. Their secret wasn't perfection. It was making time to step away from everyday no's and simply experience life together. As the fire slowly burned lower, Linda reached into an old backpack and carefully removed something wrapped inside a small cloth. She handed it to me with a smile. "I've been carrying this on every camping trip for more than 30 years. I carefully unfolded the fabric. Inside was a faded photograph of two young people standing beside an old canvas tent. On the back, One handwritten sentence caught my attention. This weekend saved our marriage. I looked up in complete silence. Then Linda quietly whispered, "There's something about that first camping trip I've never told anyone outside my family." And I knew the next part of her story would reveal a secret even more powerful than I had imagined. The secret hidden in one old photograph. What could possibly be so powerful that a couple would carry the same faded photograph on every camping trip for more than 30 years? I couldn't stop staring at the picture in my hands. Two young people stood beside an old tent, smiling at each other as if nothing else in the world existed. On the back, only one sentence had been written. "This weekend saved our marriage." I expected a romantic story. Instead, Linda shared a truth so honest and unexpected that it made me rethink stress, family life, and why millions of Americans escaped into nature whenever life becomes too loud. Linda gently took the photograph back and smiled. Robert looked at her with quiet understanding. "It wasn't because we stopped loving each other," he said. "It was because we stopped seeing each other." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Linda explained that years ago, life had become an endless routine. Work started before sunrise. Dinner happened in a hurry. Weekends disappeared into chores, shopping, and catching up on everything they hadn't finished during the week. "We were surviving," she said. "We weren't living." One Friday evening, after another meaningless argument about something neither of them could even remember later, their young daughter placed a small drawing on the kitchen table. It showed the family standing beside a tent under a sky full of stars. At the bottom she had written, "Can we be happy together again?" Linda admitted she cried the moment she saw it. The next morning, they borrowed camping equipment from neighbors and drove to a nearby state park. No perfect plan, no expensive vacation, just one decision to leave everyday life behind for a weekend. The first day felt awkward. Robert admitted, "We didn't know what to talk about." So they walked. They cooked simple meals together. They watched birds flying across the lake. They listened to the wind moving through the trees. Little by little, silence stopped feeling uncomfortable. It became peaceful. Then something remarkable happened. Without distractions, conversations returned naturally. Not because they had prepared important topics, because they finally had time to listen. As Linda shared her story, I quietly looked toward my own family. My husband was helping the children roast marshmallows. They were laughing over marshmallows that kept falling into the fire. Nobody seemed interested in taking photos. Everyone was simply enjoying the moment. For the first time, I realized why camping had become more than a vacation for so many American families. It created space for relationships to breathe again. Before going to sleep that evening, I opened my small notebook and wrote another easy English sentence. "Nature helps us slow down." I read it aloud several times, slowly, clearly. Each word felt connected to something real. That had become my favorite way to practice English. Simple sentences attached to meaningful memories stayed in my heart much longer than grammar exercises ever could. Scientists studying environmental psychology have found that spending time in natural settings can reduce stress hormones, improve emotional regulation, and increase meaningful communication between family members. Listening to Linda's story, I realized those findings weren't just scientific theories. I was watching them come alive around our own campfire. As the flames became smaller, Linda folded the old photograph and placed it carefully back inside her backpack. "I bring it every year," she whispered, "so I never forget what almost happened." I thought her story had finally reached its ending. Then Robert quietly smiled. "She forgot to tell you the most unbelievable part." Linda laughed nervously. "Oh." She looked directly at me. "The morning after that photograph was taken, something happened in these woods that neither of us has ever been able to explain." Every child around the fire leaned closer. Even the adults stopped moving. I suddenly forgot about the marshmallows, the stars, and the cool night air, because I knew whatever happened the next morning would become the story I would remember long after this camping trip was over. The sunrise that changed everything. Have you ever experienced a single morning that quietly divided your life into two parts, everything before it and everything after it? That was how Linda described the sunrise following the night she and Robert almost gave up on their marriage. Everyone around the campfire leaned closer. Even the children stopped roasting marshmallows. I expected a dramatic rescue, a miracle, or some unbelievable accident. Instead, what happened at sunrise seemed almost ordinary. Yet decades later they still believed it was the reason they never stopped returning to nature. As I listened, I realized this story was beginning to change my own family without me even noticing. Linda looked toward the dark outline of the forest before speaking again. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. She quietly stepped outside the old canvas tent. The lake was completely still. A soft layer of morning mist floated above the water. Birdsong echoed through the trees. I had never heard silence like that before. She smiled gently. It wasn't empty. It felt alive. A few minutes later, Robert joined her carrying the cups of hot coffee. Neither of them spoke. They simply sat together watching the first rays of sunlight slowly reach the lake. Then something unexpected happened. A family of deer quietly walked out from the forest and stopped only a short distance away. No one moved. No one reached for a camera. The deer looked toward them for several peaceful seconds before disappearing back into the trees. Robert laughed softly. I know it sounds silly, but somehow that tiny moment broke something inside us. Linda nodded. It broke our stress. It broke our anger. It broke the walls we had been building between us. She explained that after the deer disappeared, they started talking, not about bills, not about work, not about problems. They talked about dreams they had forgotten, books they wanted to read, places they hoped to visit, the kind of conversation they used to have years earlier. Listening to them, I suddenly remembered something. During our own camping trip, my husband and I had already laughed more into days than we had during the previous month. Without realizing it, we had slowly become more patient with each other. Maybe Linda was right. Maybe nature quietly removes distractions until all that remains is the people standing beside you. That afternoon, our family decided to take a short hike through one of the nearby forest trails. The path was peaceful. Tall pine trees stretched high above us. Sunlight filtered through the branches like golden ribbons. Our children walked ahead, pointing excitedly at squirrels, birds, and colorful wildflowers. Nobody complained about being bored. Nobody asked for Wi-Fi. At one point, my daughter reached over and held my hand without saying anything. She hadn't done that in months. It felt like the forest had gently reminded her that slowing down wasn't something to fear. It was something to enjoy. During the hike, I practiced another simple English sentence. The forest is so peaceful. I repeated it slowly while listening to birds singing overhead. Simple vocabulary, natural pronunciation, real emotion. Learning English no longer felt like studying. It felt like describing moments I wanted to remember forever. Researchers have found that spending time in forest can lower cortisol levels, improve attention, and reduce mental fatigue. Some scientists even use the term forest bathing to describe the calming effect of simply being surrounded by trees. As I walked beside my family, I understood that the greatest benefit wasn't just relaxation, it was presence. For the first time in a long while, we weren't thinking about tomorrow. We were fully living today. As the sun began to set, we returned to our campsite feeling strangely refreshed. I thought the most memorable part of our camping trip had already happened. Then a park volunteer stopped beside our picnic table with a friendly smile. "We're hosting something very special tonight," she said. "It's a tradition that's been part of this campground for generations." I smiled politely. "What kind of tradition?" She looked toward the darkening forest and quietly replied, "You'll understand why Americans fall in love with camping after tonight." Suddenly, Every camper around us started walking toward the lakeshore carrying lanterns, and I had a feeling the evening ahead would become the most unforgettable part of our entire journey. The lantern night I will never forget. What if the most unforgettable part of camping had nothing to do with mountains, lakes, or sleeping under the stars? As hundreds of campers quietly carried glowing lanterns toward the lakeshore, I realized nobody was rushing. Nobody was taking center stage, and nobody seemed interested in creating the perfect social media post. I had no idea what was about to happen, that within the next hour I would witness a tradition so simple, yet so emotional, that it completely changed my understanding of why so many American families return to nature year after year. And by the end of that evening, I found myself holding back tears for a reason I never expected. The path to the lake was softly illuminated by dozens of lanterns. Children walked beside grandparents. Young couples held hands. Friends laughed quietly as if they already knew what was coming. No loud music, no flashing lights, only the gentle sound of footsteps and crickets singing in the distance. When everyone gathered along the shoreline, a park volunteer welcomed us with a warm smile. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate gratitude." There was no complicated ceremony. Instead, she invited everyone to spend 1 minute thinking about something they were thankful for. The lake became completely silent. I closed my eyes. At first, I thought about ordinary things. My family, our health, our home. Then my thoughts slowly changed. I realized I was grateful for something much smaller. This moment, no phone, no schedule, no pressure, just the people I loved standing beside me. After the quiet reflection, each family was invited to place a small floating lantern onto the lake. My daughter carefully held ours. "What should we wish for?" she whispered. I smiled. "Let's not make a wish." She looked surprised. "What should we do then?" "Let's say thank you." Together, we gently placed the lantern onto the calm water. Slowly, hundreds of tiny lights drifted across the lake like stars floating on the surface. It was one of the most peaceful sights I had ever seen. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody interrupted the silence. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that some moments become more beautiful when words are few. My husband quietly reached for my hand. Without thinking, I held it. Neither of us needed to say anything. For the first time in a very long time, silence didn't feel empty. It felt comforting. Around us, families smiled at one another. Some hugged. Some quietly cried. I suddenly understood why camping traditions become lifelong memories. They slow life down just enough for people to notice what truly matters. Later, while we walked back toward our campsite, my son asked a question that made everyone stop. "Mom." "Yes, why don't we feel like this at home?" No one answered immediately. Finally, I smiled. Maybe home isn't the problem. Maybe we're just too busy to notice how happy we already are. He nodded thoughtfully. That simple conversation became another unforgettable English lesson for me. Back inside our tent, I opened my notebook and wrote one short sentence. "Nature brings us together." I read it aloud several times, slowly, clearly. Every word felt connected to the lanterns floating across the lake. Learning English through real experiences had become surprisingly natural because every sentence carried a memory instead of just vocabulary. Positive psychology researchers often explain that practicing gratitude can improve emotional well-being, strengthen relationships, and reduce stress. Watching hundreds of families quietly reflecting together beside the lake, I realized gratitude becomes even more powerful when shared with the people you love. Perhaps that was one of camping's greatest gifts. It gently reminded people to appreciate what had been there all along. As we prepared for bed, I believed the camping trip had already given us everything we needed. Then I noticed something unusual. A folded note had been tucked beneath the zipper of our tent. There was no name, only one handwritten sentence. "Meet us at Sunrise Point tomorrow morning. Bring your family." I looked around the campground. Nobody seemed to be watching us, but somehow, I had a feeling the mysterious invitation was connected to Linda and Robert, and whatever waited for us at Sunrise Point would become the most meaningful moment of our entire journey. The Sunrise Point surprise. What could be important enough for someone to leave a mysterious handwritten note outside our tent in the middle of the night? I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I wondered who had written it, and why they wanted our family to meet them at Sunrise Point before dawn. Was it Linda and Robert? A campground tradition? Or something completely unexpected? As the first light began to appear above the trees, we quietly followed the narrow trail, completely unaware that the next hour would become the emotional heart of our entire camping journey. The morning air was cool and perfectly still. A thin layer of mist floated above the forest floor. Our children walked unusually quietly, almost as if they understood this wasn't an ordinary hike. When we reached Sunrise Point, I stopped walking. Dozens of families were already there. Some sat on blankets, others held steaming cups of coffee. Nobody seemed in a hurry. Everyone simply faced the eastern sky. Then I saw Linda and Robert. Linda smiled as soon as she noticed us. "I'm glad you came," I laughed softly. "Was the note from you?" She nodded. "There are some things you can only understand by seeing them." For several minutes, no one spoke. The sky slowly changed from deep blue to soft orange. Then, almost magically, the first rays of sunlight reached the distant mountains. A quiet wave of golden light spread across the trees below us. Someone whispered, "Here it comes." The entire forest seemed to wake up at once. Birds began singing. The cool air felt warmer. Even the children stood perfectly still. I had watched countless sunrises before, but never like this. Not surrounded by people who weren't staring at phones. Not without anyone trying to hurry the moment. Not with my family standing quietly beside me. Linda looked toward the horizon. "This," she whispered, "is why we never stop coming back." I finally understood. Camping wasn't about escaping life. It was about remembering how to live it. After sunrise, the families gathered for a simple breakfast prepared by campground volunteers. Fresh pancakes, fruit, hot coffee. Nothing fancy. Yet, somehow it tasted better than meals at expensive restaurants. Perhaps because nobody was rushing. Children from different families played together as if they had known each other for years. Adults exchanged hiking tips, recipes, and stories. Nobody asked what anyone did for work. Status didn't seem important here. Character did. One volunteer smiled at me. "First camping trip." I nodded. "I think it won't be our last." She laughed. "That's what everyone says." While helping serve breakfast, I practiced another easy English sentence. "Can I help you?" Simple words, friendly tone, useful in everyday life. The volunteer smiled. "Yes. Thank you." Real conversations like this made learning English feel effortless, because every sentence belonged to a genuine experience instead of an artificial lesson. Researchers studying time spent outdoors often suggest that shared experiences in nature strengthen trust, increase empathy. I was watching a community built through simple moments, sharing food, helping strangers, and appreciating the same sunrise together. Just before everyone began leaving, Linda handed me a small wooden token. On one side, it was engraved with a tiny pine tree. On the other side, only 4 words appeared. "Leave nature better always." She smiled. "Every family who camps here receives one." I turned the token over in my hand. "It isn't a souvenir," Robert added. "It's a promise." As we packed our bags later that morning, I slipped the wooden token into my backpack, believing it would become my favorite memory from the trip. I was wrong. Just as we were about to drive home, my youngest son ran toward the edge of the forest and shouted, "Mom, You need to see this. The excitement in his voice made every adult stop instantly. I hurried after him, never imagining that what he had discovered among the trees would become the final lesson our family would carry home long after the camping trip had ended. The tiny tree that changed our future. How could one tiny discovery in the forest become the most meaningful souvenir our family had ever brought home? When my youngest son called us toward the edge of the trail, I expected him to find another squirrel, an interesting rock, or maybe a colorful bird. Instead, he was pointing at a tiny pine seedling growing between two large stones. It looked so small that most people would have walked right past it. Yet, the conversation that followed around that little tree completely changed how I understood camping, family traditions, and the quiet lessons nature teaches every day. "Mom, look how tiny it is." He carefully knelt beside the little pine. "It survived all these big rocks." I smiled. It did. Our park volunteer happened to be walking nearby. She stopped and looked at the seedling with us. "That little tree is stronger than it looks." My daughter looked surprised. "Really?" The volunteer nodded. "Its roots are already searching deep underground, even though you can't see them." Her words stayed with me. Sometimes the most important growth happens when nobody is looking. I quietly thought about our own family. Only a few days earlier, we had arrived feeling tired, distracted, and constantly connected to our devices. Now something invisible had changed. We laughed more. We listened better. We spoke more kindly to one another. Those changes weren't dramatic. They were quiet, just like the roots of that tiny tree. Before leaving, the volunteer handed each child a small envelope. Inside were seeds from native wildflowers. "We give these to young campers every season," she explained, "so they'll remember that nature gives back when we care for it." My children immediately started talking about planting them in our backyard. Not because anyone told them to, because they genuinely wanted to. Watching their excitement made me realize that camping had taught lessons no classroom could fully explain: respect, patience, responsibility, wonder. On the drive home, something unusual happened again. No one asked for a tablet. No one complained that the trip was over. Instead, everyone shared favorite memories. "The deer," my son said. "The lanterns," my daughter smiled. "The sunrise," my husband added. Then everyone looked at me. "What about you?" I thought for a moment. The conversations. That answer surprised even me. The greatest memory wasn't a place. It was finally having enough time to truly hear the people I loved. When we arrived home, our house looked exactly the same. The furniture hadn't changed. The walls hadn't changed. Even our daily responsibilities were still waiting for us. But somehow, we had changed. That evening, while unpacking our camping gear, I found a wooden token Linda had given me. "Leave nature better always." I placed it beside my English notebook before writing one final sentence from the trip. Small moments become big memories. I repeated it slowly. Each word felt warm because it belonged to a real experience. Learning English had become much easier since every sentence now carried emotion, not just vocabulary. I wasn't memorizing language anymore. I was remembering life. Researchers studying family experiences often find that shared outdoor adventures create stronger long-term memories than many material gifts because emotions strengthen memory formation. Looking around our dinner table that evening, I understood exactly why. None of us talked about what we had bought during the weekend. We talked about what we had felt. Days passed, then weeks. Yet, something interesting continued happening inside our home. The children spent more time outside. Family dinners lasted longer. Weekend walks slowly replaced endless scrolling on our phones. Camping hadn't magically solved every problem. It had simply reminded us what deserved our attention. One quiet evening, as I opened the kitchen drawer to grab a pen, I noticed the small wooden token again. Behind it was a folded piece of paper I didn't remember placing there. Curious, I opened it. It was the note Linda had secretly slipped into my backpack before we left the campground. Only one handwritten sentence appeared. "The real camping trip begins after you return home." I smiled, because I suddenly realized our greatest adventure hadn't ended in the forest at all. It was only beginning. Nature didn't change. I did. What if the greatest adventure of your life doesn't happen on a mountain trail, beside a campfire, or under a sky full of stars? What if it begins the moment you return home? Weeks after our camping trip ended, I realized something incredible. The forest hadn't followed us back to our house. Yet its quiet lessons were still changing the way we spoke, laughed, loved, and lived together every single day. That was the moment I finally understood why millions of Americans keep returning to nature. They aren't escaping real life. They're returning to it. The first Monday after our trip looked completely ordinary. Alarm clocks rang. Breakfast needed to be prepared. The children packed their school bags. My husband headed to work. Nothing around us had changed, but something inside us had. Breakfast lasted a little longer because nobody reached for a phone. Dinner became our favorite time of day because everyone had a story to tell. Weekend afternoons slowly transformed from shopping trips into neighborhood walks, local parks, and simple picnics under the trees. Without planning it, we had brought a small piece of the campground home with us. One Saturday morning, my daughter surprised me. "Mom." "Yes, can we eat outside today?" I smiled, of course. So instead of sitting around the dining table, we carried our sandwiches into the backyard. There were no mountains, no lake, no campfire, just green grass, fresh air, and our family. Strangely, it felt almost the same. My son laughed while chasing butterflies. My husband read a story aloud. I simply sat there listening, not because something extraordinary was happening, because ordinary moments had become extraordinary again. A few weeks later, we visited a nearby state park for a short afternoon hike. It wasn't a vacation. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't carefully planned. It had quietly become part of our family rhythm. I finally understood something Linda had said. Camping isn't a place. It's a reminder to slow down, a reminder to notice, a reminder to protect both nature and the relationships growing inside our own homes. That evening, I opened my English notebook for one final lesson. I slowly wrote, "Nature helps us find ourselves." Then I added another sentence. "Home feels different now." I read both aloud, slowly, clearly, naturally. Those simple English sentences no longer felt like language practice. They had become memories I could pronounce. Every word carried the sound of birds singing, children laughing, campfires glowing, and quiet conversations beneath the stars. Learning English through real stories had taught me something unexpected. When your heart understands a sentence, your mind remembers it much more easily. Researchers continue to find that spending regular time in nature supports emotional well-being, strengthens family relationships, improves attention, and lowers everyday stress. Looking back, I realized those findings perfectly matched our experience. Nature didn't remove every challenge from our lives. It simply helped us respond to those challenges with calmer minds and closer hearts. People still ask me today, why do Americans love camping so much? I smile every time, because I know the answer isn't really about tents, or hiking trails, or roasting marshmallows. It's about creating space for conversations that busy lives often steal away. It's about watching children rediscover curiosity. It's about marriages remembering friendship. It's about families becoming present again. Most of all, it's about realizing that happiness often waits in the quiet places we rush past every day. If this story leaves you with one thought, let it be this. You don't have to travel far to let nature reset your heart. Sometimes all it takes is one walk, one sunset, one campfire, one conversation without distractions, and one decision to be fully present with the people you love. That simple choice might become the beginning of your own unforgettable story. That is all for today. I will make many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you won't miss the next one.